Wyoming Territory, 1882. The first snow of winter swept across the high plains like a spirit, dusting the rugged landscape in a coat of pristine white that would soon give way to the harsh realities of frontier life. Preston Xavier stood at the edge of the Diamond Creek Ranch, his 6-foot frame silhouetted against the endless Wyoming sky. At 25, Preston had already weathered more storms than most men twice his age, and the frontier had carved its mark into the set of his shoulders and the caution in his green eyes. He watched as the last cattle were driven into the winter pasture, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The Diamond Creek spread wasn't his, but working as foreman for the past 3 years had given him pride in every fence post and head of cattle. It was honest work, and out here that was all a man needed, or so he told himself. "Fine job with that herd, Preston," called Emmett Johnson, the aging ranch owner who had taken a chance on the young cowboy when few others would. "Might be the best winter count we've had." Preston nodded, adjusting his worn Stetson over his light brown hair. "Weather holds, we might not lose more than a dozen head this season." What Preston didn't say, what he never said, was that the success of the ranch filled only part of the emptiness that had followed him since his family's massacre 8 years ago. The Comanche raid had taken everything: his parents, his little sister, and his belief that life offered anything beyond mere survival. The frontier was no place for sentiment or softness. Those who forgot that ended up dead. As twilight descended, Preston made his way to the bunkhouse, deliberately slowing his pace to delay joining the raucous card games and tall tales that filled the evening hours. The other cowboys had families back east, sweethearts in town, or at least memories of them. Preston had chosen to have none of that. Attachment was a luxury that the frontier made you pay for, usually in blood. "You're brooding again," said Samuel, the cook and one of the few men Preston would grudgingly call a friend. The older man handed him a tin cup of coffee. "Young man like you should be in town courting, not staring at the horizon like it might give you answers." "The only answer I need is whether that north fence will hold through the blizzards," Preston replied, accepting the coffee but not the implied invitation to open up. Samuel shook his head. "Some fences need mending more than others, son." Preston ignored the metaphor. He had built his life around a simple truth: the frontier was for the hard-hearted, and he intended to remain that way. Romance, family, connection, these were distractions that got men killed out west. Love was a weakness he couldn't afford. The following morning dawned clear and cold as Preston rode toward Sweetwater, the nearest town of any significance. The supply list from the ranch was tucked securely in his coat, but his mind wandered as the dun gelding picked its way across the frozen landscape. There was something about the first snowfall that always stirred unwelcome memories: his mother's voice singing Christmas carols, his father's rare laughter, his little sister's wonder at the frost patterns on the windows. Preston pushed those thoughts away. 8 years was long enough to know better. Sweetwater emerged from the plains like most frontier towns, a collection of wooden structures defiantly arranged against the wilderness. Main Street boasted the essential businesses: general store, blacksmith, saloon, small hotel, and the newly established telegraph office that connected this outpost to the civilized world beyond. As Preston tied his horse outside Willard's general store, the commotion down the street caught his attention. A stagecoach had arrived, unusual for this time of year when most travelers had the sense to avoid the brutal Wyoming winter. Curious despite himself, Preston watched as the driver helped down a single passenger, a young woman. Even from a distance, there was something striking about her. She stood straight-backed amid the swirling snow, her dark blue traveling dress stark against the whiteness. A matching bonnet framed her face, though Preston was too far away to make out her features. What he could see was her evident confusion as she looked around the rustic town, clutching a small valise in her gloved hands. Turning away, Preston entered the store. The woman's predicament was none of his concern. Sweetwater would either welcome her or chew her up and spit her out. That was the way of the frontier. "Morning, Preston," called Willard from behind the counter. "Bit early for the ranch supply run, ain't it?" "Emmett's worried about the passes closing early this year," Preston replied, handing over the list. "I'll need this loaded by noon." While Willard gathered the supplies, the shop door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the woman from the stagecoach. Up close, Preston was struck by her youth. She couldn't be more than 22, and the determined set of her jaw that contrasted with the uncertainty in her eyes. Her bonnet was now removed, revealing hair the color of honey in summer, twisted into a practical but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. "Excuse me," she addressed Willard, her voice carrying the refined tones of the East. "I'm looking for Sheriff Miller. I was told he might be able to help me find my uncle's property." Willard leaned against the counter. "Sheriff's probably at his office down the street, miss." "Lawson." "Katherine Lawson," she straightened slightly. "My uncle was James Lawson. I believe he had a claim somewhere near here." The name struck Preston like a physical blow. James Lawson had owned the small homestead adjacent to Diamond Creek Ranch, a hardworking man who died in a flash flood the previous spring. His body had been found. Preston himself had helped recover it. The property had stood empty since then. Willard's expression confirmed Preston's recollection. "James Lawson." "Miss, I'm sorry to tell you, but your uncle passed on last April." The color drained from Catherine's face, but she maintained her composure with visible effort. I see. I had written to him, but when no reply came, I feared. Though I had hoped perhaps the letters simply hadn't reached him. "Frontier mail's unreliable at best," Willard offered sympathetically. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings you all the way out here?" Katherine hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "After my father died last summer, there was nothing keeping me in Boston. Uncle James had written years ago inviting us to join him. I had hoped." She paused, visibly collecting herself. "Well, it seems I've come a very long way for nothing." Preston had remained silent, but something about her dignified struggle against obvious distress compelled him to speak. "The Lawson property is still there. No one's claimed it since your uncle passed." Katherine turned toward him, noticing him properly for the first time. Her eyes were a clear blue, the color of Wyoming's summer sky, and they widened slightly as she took in his tall frame and the trail-worn clothes that nonetheless couldn't hide the breadth of his shoulders. "And you are," she asked. "Preston Xavier, ma'am, foreman at Diamond Creek Ranch. Your uncle's property borders our north pasture." "I see," she replied, studying him with an intelligence that made Preston inexplicably uncomfortable. "Do you know the condition of the property? Is it habitable?" The question took both men by surprise. "Miss Lawson," Willard interjected, "you're not considering staying, are you? That place has been empty for months, winter's setting in." "It's no place for a woman alone," Katherine finished, a flash of steel entering her voice. "I assure you, Mr. Willard, I'm quite determined. If the property was my uncle's, then by law it should pass to my father, and now to me, unless someone else has made a claim." "No claim," Preston said slowly, "but that doesn't mean it's fit for living. Your uncle's cabin is solid enough, but it's been untended. There might be damage, and winter here isn't like Boston." Katherine met his gaze directly. "Mr. Xavier, I appreciate your concern, but I've sold everything to come west. I have nowhere to return to, even if I wish to. Now, can someone direct me to this property, or must I find it myself?" The determination in her eyes reminded Preston of something he'd long buried, the fierce will to survive against impossible odds. It was familiar and it was dangerous. This woman would get herself killed with that kind of stubborn pride, yet somehow he heard himself saying, "I can take you there. I'm headed back that way once my supplies are loaded." The relief that crossed Katherine's face was quickly masked by practiced composure. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Xavier." As she left to speak with the sheriff about her uncle's legal affairs, Willard gave Preston a look that said everything about the folly of getting involved. That one's trouble, Preston. Not the usual kind, mind you, but trouble all the same. Preston couldn't disagree. Katherine Lawson represented exactly the kind of complication he'd spent years avoiding. But something about her reminded him of himself, alone, determined, facing a frontier that devoured the weak and unwary. The difference was that he knew how to survive out here. She didn't stand a chance. It would be a simple act of decency to see her safely to her property, nothing more. After that, her fate was her own concern, just like everyone else's on this merciless frontier. By midday, the supplies were loaded into the wagon, and Katherine had returned from her business with the sheriff. She had acquired a few additional bundles from the store, no doubt essential provisions that Willard had convinced her she would need. "Sheriff Miller confirmed the property is legally mine," she informed Preston as he helped her onto the wagon seat. "He seemed quite surprised by my intention to stay." "Most folks would be," Preston replied, taking up the reins. "Your uncle was well respected, but he was a hardened frontiersman, lived out here 30 years. This territory breaks even men like that eventually. Katherine didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the white landscape ahead as they left Sweetwater behind. Finally, she said, "People have been telling me what I cannot do my entire life, Mr. Xavier. First my father, then various suitors who thought a woman should be content with needlepoint and piano playing, and now everyone in this town. I find it tiresome." Despite himself, Preston felt a reluctant admiration for her spirit. "It's not about what you can or cannot do, Miss Lawson. It's about what the frontier will do to you regardless." "And what is that exactly?" she challenged. "It will strip away everything civilized and comfortable until all that's left is survival," he said bluntly. "The frontier doesn't care about your determination or your legal rights. The first blizzard, the first drought, the first encounter with the wrong sort of men, any of these can kill you just as dead as your uncle." Katherine's hands tightened on her reticule. "Then I shall have to adapt, won't I?" The journey to the Lawson property took over 2 hours, during which Katherine's initial defiance gradually gave way to silent contemplation as the vastness of the Wyoming Territory revealed itself. Preston respected her enough not to fill the silence with false reassurances. When they finally approached the small homestead nestled in a protected valley, Preston watched Katherine's face carefully. The cabin was sturdy enough. James Lawson had been a skilled builder, but it stood forlorn and weathered, with a sagging porch and windows dark with dust and cobwebs. A neglected vegetable garden had returned to the wild, and the small corral beside the barn held nothing but snow and memories. "This is it," Preston said quietly, "your uncle's place." Katherine's expression revealed nothing, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her reticule tighter. "It's smaller than I expected." "It's solid. Good location with the creek nearby that doesn't freeze completely. Your uncle chose well." He helped her down from the wagon and carried her valise and bundles to the porch. The door was secured with a simple latch, unneeded in a territory where distance provided more security than locks. Inside, the cabin was cold and musty but intact. A single room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a curtained alcove that presumably held a bed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furnishings, a table, 2 chairs, shelves with a few books and utilitarian items, spoke of a life lived simply. Katherine stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. For the first time, Preston saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. "Winter's coming fast," he said, the words emerging before he could stop them. "You can't stay here alone, not now. There's a boarding house in Sweetwater. You could wait out the winter there, learn about the territory, make your plans for spring." Katherine's chin lifted. "And watch my inheritance deteriorate further while paying for board I can ill afford. No, Mr. Xavier, I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision." Preston knew that look. He'd worn it himself often enough, the stubborn pride that would rather die than admit a mistake. It was a look that got people killed on the frontier. "At least let me help you get settled," he found himself saying. "The place needs wood, a fire, some basic repairs before nightfall. I can't in good conscience leave you here like this." Something in Katherine's expression softened slightly. "That would be kind of you, Mr. Xavier. But I wouldn't want to impose on your duties at the ranch." "Emmett will understand," Preston replied, already rolling up his sleeves. "No one should face their first night on the frontier without a proper fire and secure roof." For the next few hours, Preston worked methodically through the essential tasks: chopping wood, clearing the chimney, checking for any damage that might let in the bitter night air, bringing water from the creek. Katherine, refusing to be idle, set about cleaning the interior and organizing her meager supplies. As dusk approached, the cabin had transformed. A fire crackled in the hearth, the worst of the dust and cobwebs had been banished, and the shelves held Katherine's carefully rationed provisions. Preston had even discovered James Lawson's root cellar, which still contained preserved vegetables and cured meat that would supplement her stores. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Xavier," Katherine said as they stood on the porch, the setting sun painting the snowy landscape in shades of pink and gold. "I'm truly grateful." Preston nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He'd done nothing more than basic human decency required. "I'll check back in a few days, make sure you're managing." "That isn't necessary," she replied quickly. "I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to." "Maybe so," he agreed, but Emmett would have my hide if I let James Lawson's niece freeze to death her first week here. Neighborly obligation, nothing more. Catherine's lips curved in a small smile. Of course, neighborly obligation. As Preston rode back toward Diamond Creek in the gathering darkness, he tried to convince himself that his concern for Katherine Lawson was indeed nothing more than that, an obligation to a neighbor, a basic courtesy extended to a woman clearly out of her depth. But something about her determination, her refusal to be cowed by the enormity of what she faced, had stirred a long-dormant feeling in him. Not attraction, he wouldn't allow that, but a kind of kinship. They were both stubborn fools facing the frontier on their own terms, and that, Preston knew, was exactly the kind of thinking that created attachments. Attachments led to caring, caring led to pain, and pain was the one luxury a man of the frontier could never afford. The next few days at Diamond Creek kept Preston busier than usual. A section of fence had come down in the north pasture, allowing several head of cattle to wander dangerously close to the frozen creek. Rounding them up and repairing the damage in the bitter cold had occupied him from dawn to dusk, leaving little time for thoughts of Katherine Lawson, or so he told himself. In truth, her face appeared unbidden in quiet moments, her determined blue eyes, the dignified lift of her chin when challenged, the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. He found himself wondering how she was faring, whether she'd managed to keep the fire going, if she discovered the frozen pipes that had plagued her uncle every winter. On the fourth day, Emmett approached him as he finished the fence repairs. "Heard you took James Lawson's niece out to his place," the ranch owner said casually. Preston nodded. She arrived on the stage, didn't know her uncle had passed. "And you left her there, alone?" Emmett's bushy eyebrows rose. "That don't sound like you, Preston." "Wasn't my decision to make. She's determined to claim her inheritance." Emmett scratched his beard thoughtfully. Determined or not, a young woman alone out here. "That's asking for trouble. Might be worth checking on her, seeing as we're neighbors and all." Preston recognized the suggestion for what it was, an order wrapped in casual concern. "I was planning to ride over tomorrow," he admitted. "Just to make sure she hasn't frozen to death." Emmett nodded approvingly. "Take her some of Mrs. Henderson's bread when you go, and that extra blanket from the storage room." Neighborly gestures. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Preston packed the suggested items along with a few additional supplies that might prove useful: matches, lamp oil, some coffee and sugar. Mere neighborly courtesies, he told himself. As he approached the Lawson homestead, the first thing he noticed was smoke rising steadily from the chimney. The second was Katherine herself, struggling with an armful of wood from the pile he'd left stacked against the cabin. She wore a heavy coat that had probably been her uncle's, much too large for her slight frame, and her honey-colored hair was loosely braided down her back. She looked up at the sound of his horse, her cheeks flushed from exertion and cold, and for a moment something like relief crossed her face before she composed herself. "Mr. Xavier," she called, straightening as he dismounted. "What a surprise." Preston took the wood from her arms without asking. "Just checking to see if you're still alive, Miss Lawson." A smile tugged at her lips. "As you can see, I'm managing. Please come in. I was just about to make tea." Inside, the cabin was transformed from the musty, abandoned place he'd first shown her. Katherine had clearly spent her days cleaning and organizing. The simple furniture gleamed with polish, curtains fashioned from what looked like a traveling dress hung at the windows, and the bed alcove now had a patchwork quilt that added unexpected color to the rustic space. Most surprising was the smell, not just the wood smoke and pine scent of clean floors, but something else. Something that reminded Preston of his mother's kitchen long ago. "Is that bread?" he asked, unable to hide his surprise. Katherine looked almost embarrassed. "I found my uncle's Dutch oven. It took some experimentation, but I managed something edible on the third try." She gestured to a misshapen but golden brown loaf cooling on the table. "It's not what I was used to baking in Boston, but it serves its purpose." Preston set down his saddlebags. "I brought some things from the ranch. Mrs. Henderson's bread, for one, though it seems you've beaten me to it." "How thoughtful," Katherine said, genuine appreciation warming her voice. "Please sit. The tea will be ready shortly." As she moved about the small kitchen area, Preston noticed the changes in her after just a few days on the frontier. Her movements were more efficient, less the careful grace of a society lady, and more the purposeful motions of someone who had learned quickly that wasted energy meant wasted resources. Her hands, though still obviously a lady's, showed signs of work, a small burn on one finger, a scrape across the knuckles. "You've been busy," he observed. Katherine nodded. "There's much to do. I've been taking inventory of what's here, what needs repair, what I'll need to acquire." She placed a steaming cup before him. "I found my uncle's journal. He kept meticulous records of the property, when to plant, where the best hunting is, how to predict weather changes. It's been invaluable." Preston took a sip of the tea, surprised at the comfort of the simple gesture in this remote place. "And have you encountered any difficulties?" Her hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Nothing I couldn't manage. The pump froze yesterday, but I remembered reading about pouring hot water to thaw it." She sat across from him, cradling her own cup. "I won't pretend it's been easy, Mr. Xavier, but I refuse to be defeated by inconveniences." Calling the brutal challenges of frontier survival inconveniences struck Preston as either remarkably brave or utterly foolish, possibly both. "Winter's barely begun," he warned. "What you've faced so far is nothing compared to what's coming." Catherine's blue eyes met his directly. "Then I suppose I'll have to continue adapting." She tilted her head slightly. "You don't believe I can survive here, do you?" The blunt question caught Preston off guard. "I believe the frontier doesn't care one way or another if you survive, Miss Lawson. It's indifferent to your determination or your circumstances." "Then we have something in common, your frontier and I," she replied with unexpected sharpness. "I, too, am indifferent to circumstances that others might consider insurmountable." For the first time, Preston wondered about the life she'd left behind. What had shaped this young woman's fierce independence? What had driven her to choose this harsh existence over whatever remained for her in Boston? Before he could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Katherine glanced toward them with a slight frown. "The weather's turning." Preston followed her gaze. Indeed, the clear blue sky had given way to ominous clouds moving rapidly from the north, a telltale sign of an approaching blizzard. "I should get back," he said, rising quickly. "That storm will hit within hours." Katherine walked him to the door, concern evident in her expression. "Will you make it back to Diamond Creek in time?" "If I ride fast," Preston replied, already calculating the distance and the storm's approach. She handed him a cloth-wrapped package. "Take some of the bread, for your trouble in checking on me." The simple gesture struck Preston with unexpected force. How long had it been since anyone had shown him such basic kindness? Since he'd allowed anyone to do so. "Thank you," he said, tucking the package into his saddlebag, alongside the supplies he'd brought for her but hadn't mentioned, the extra blanket, the coffee, the sugar. "Bar the door behind me, keep the fire fed. If the storm lasts more than 2 days, start rationing your wood." Katherine nodded, her expression serious. "I will." As Preston mounted his horse, the wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of snow. Katherine stood in the doorway, one hand holding her borrowed coat closed at her throat, watching him. "Be careful, Mr. Xavier," she called above the rising wind. Something in her voice, genuine concern, perhaps caused Preston to pause. "You too, Miss Lawson." The ride back to Diamond Creek became increasingly treacherous as the storm gathered strength. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, snow was falling heavily, driven sideways by a bitter wind that cut through even Preston's heavy coat. He barely had time to stable his horse and make it to the main house before the full fury of the blizzard descended. That night, as the wind howled around the sturdy ranch buildings, Preston found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the small cabin miles away, where Katherine Lawson faced her first Wyoming blizzard alone. Had she secured everything properly? Would the roof hold under the weight of snow? Did she have enough wood to last? More disturbing was the realization that he cared about the answers to these questions. Despite his determination to maintain the emotional distance that had kept him alive and sane for 8 years, he found himself genuinely concerned for this stubborn, proud young woman who had challenged his every assumption. The blizzard raged for 3 days. 3 days during which Preston threw himself into indoor tasks around the ranch, mending tack, taking inventory, repairing tools, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering to the Lawson homestead. By the time the storm finally broke, leaving behind 4 feet of snow and transformed landscape, his concern had grown to genuine worry. Planning to check on Miss Lawson today, Emmett asked casually over breakfast on the fourth day. Preston nodded, not bothering to pretend otherwise. As soon as I've cleared a path to the stables. Take the sleigh, the ranch owner suggested, and some of our supplies. Young lady might be running short after that blow. The journey to the Lawson property took twice as long through the deep snow, even with the sleigh. As Preston crested the final rise that would bring the cabin into view, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and dread. The small valley came into view, white and pristine in the aftermath of the storm. Preston's eyes immediately sought out the cabin, and he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding when he saw smoke rising steadily from the chimney. As he guided the sleigh closer, he could see that someone, Katherine herself, obviously, had attempted to clear a path from the door to the woodpile, though the fresh snow reached nearly to her waist in places. The effort it must have taken impressed him despite himself. The cabin door opened before he could announce himself, and Katherine emerged, wrapped in her overlarge coat. Her face, when she pushed back the hood, showed signs of the ordeal: dark circles under her eyes, chapped lips, a smudge of soot on one cheek, but her eyes lit with unmistakable relief at the sight of him. "Mr. Xavier," she called, wading through the snow toward the sleigh. I was beginning to wonder if anyone would make it through. Preston jumped down, immediately sinking to his knees in snow. The storm was worse than expected. "Are you all right?" Katherine nodded, though he could see the weariness in her posture. The roof leaked in one corner, but I managed to catch most of the water. And I had to be rather creative with the wood supply toward the end. She gestured toward the property line. "I'm afraid I may have borrowed a few fence posts from the boundary. I'll replace them when the snow melts." The admission, so matter-of-fact, so practical, startled a laugh from Preston. "You tore down fence posts for firewood." "Only 3, she clarified, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. And only after the storm showed no signs of abating on the second day. Preston shook his head, a reluctant admiration growing within him. Most greenhorns would have frozen rather than think to dismantle a fence. "Miss Lawson, you continue to surprise me." A faint blush colored her cheeks, though whether from his words or the bitter cold he couldn't tell. "Necessity breeds resourcefulness, Mr. Xavier. Now, won't you come inside? I've managed to keep some coffee hot." The cabin was noticeably colder than during his last visit, though still comfortable compared to the frigid air outside. Katherine had clearly been conserving wood, allowing the fire to burn lower than was ideal. The leak she'd mentioned had left a dark stain on the floor beneath one corner of the roof, where a bucket still sat to catch occasional drips. "I brought supplies," Preston said, returning to the sleigh for the provisions Emmett had insisted on sending. "Food, wood, some tools to fix that leak." Katherine's expression wavered between pride and pragmatism. For a moment he thought she might refuse the help, but practicality won out. "That's very kind," she said finally. "I would be grateful for the assistance, especially with the roof. I tried to reach it, but—" The image of Katherine Lawson, barely over 5 feet tall, attempting to climb onto the snow-covered roof made Preston simultaneously concerned and impressed. This woman was either the most stubborn or the most determined person he'd ever encountered, perhaps both. They spent the next few hours working side by side, Preston repairing the roof leak and chopping enough wood to last through another storm, Katherine organizing the supplies and preparing a simple but nourishing meal from their combined resources. The domestic rhythm felt strangely comfortable, though Preston tried not to examine that feeling too closely. As they sat at the small table sharing bowls of stew, Katherine said suddenly, "May I ask you something, Mr. Xavier?" Preston nodded, wary but curious. "Why did you really come to check on me? The truth, please." The directness of her question shouldn't have surprised him by now, but it did. Preston considered deflecting with another comment about neighborly obligation, but something in her steady gaze demanded honesty. "I was concerned," he admitted finally. "You're alone out here, new to the frontier, facing the worst winter in years. It would be irresponsible to ignore that." Katherine's eyes never left his face. "Is that the only reason?" "Responsibility." Preston set down his spoon, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but unwilling to lie. "What other reason would there be, Miss Lawson?" "Perhaps the same reason I felt relieved when I saw you coming through the snow," she replied quietly. "Because in a place where isolation is the norm, human connection becomes more valuable, not less. The simple truth of her words struck Preston with unexpected force. For years, he had convinced himself that isolation was protection, that cutting himself off from others was the only way to survive the loss and pain that the frontier inevitably delivered. Yet here was this woman suggesting the exact opposite, that connection was not weakness but strength. "The frontier isn't kind to connections, Miss Lawson," he said finally. "People leave, people die. Caring about them only makes the loss harder." Catherine's expression softened with something that looked dangerously like understanding. "And you've experienced such loss?" The question prodded at wounds Preston had long since buried. For a moment, he considered rising from the table, ending this conversation before it ventured into territory he had declared forbidden. But something, perhaps the honest concern in her eyes, perhaps the shared intimacy of surviving the blizzard, loosened his tongue. "My family was killed by Comanche raiders when I was 17, he said, the words emerging rough and unpracticed. "I was hunting, came back to find everything gone, parents, little sister, our home burned. Since then I've learned it's safer not to attach." Catherine's hand moved across the table, coming to rest near his but not quite touching. "I'm so sorry, Preston. That's a terrible burden to carry alone." The use of his given name, so unexpected and intimate, sent a jolt through him. How long had it been since anyone had addressed him with such genuine compassion? "What about you?" he asked, desperate to shift the focus. "What drove you to leave Boston for this?" A shadow crossed Catherine's face. "After my father died, I discovered his finances were not as secure as I'd believed. His business partner claimed debts that required selling our home to satisfy. The alternative was," she hesitated, "a marriage of convenience to the partner's son. I chose independence instead." Preston studied her across the table, this young woman who had abandoned everything familiar to avoid being controlled, who had traveled thousands of miles alone to claim a modest inheritance in a harsh territory rather than surrender her freedom. In that moment, he recognized in Katherine Lawson the same fierce will to survive on her own terms that had driven him for the past 8 years. But while his response had been to withdraw, to isolate himself from anything that might cause pain, hers had been to press forward, to claim her place in the world despite all obstacles. "You're a remarkable woman, Katherine Lawson," he said, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. Her eyes widened slightly at his use of her given name, and a soft flush colored her cheeks. "I'm simply practical, Mr. Xavier. One adapts or one perishes." "Preston," he corrected, surprising himself. "If we're to be neighbors, you might as well use my name." A smile, genuine, warm, unguarded, transformed her face. "Preston, then." As dusk began to fall, Preston reluctantly acknowledged that he should return to Diamond Creek before darkness made the journey treacherous. Katherine walked him to the sleigh, now packed with the empty containers he'd brought supplies in. "When will the snow melt enough for regular travel?" she asked, looking out across the transformed landscape. "Not for weeks," Preston admitted, "but I'll check on you again in a few days." The path should be easier with the sleigh tracks already broken. Katherine nodded, hugging her oversized coat more tightly around herself. "I'd appreciate that, not because I need assistance," she added quickly, "but because I've discovered I don't mind company as much as I expected to." The honest admission brought a smile to Preston's face. "I find myself in similar circumstances, Miss Lawson." "Katherine," she corrected softly, "if we're to be neighbors." As Preston drove the sleigh back toward Diamond Creek, the winter sun setting behind the mountains and painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, he found himself contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. For years he had maintained a careful distance from others, convinced that emotional attachment was a luxury the frontier made you pay for dearly. Yet in the span of just a few weeks, Katherine Lawson had begun to challenge that belief. Her determination, her resilience, her willingness to face the harsh realities of frontier life on her own terms, all of these awakened something in him that he had thought long dead. It wasn't love, he wouldn't allow himself to use that word, but it was a recognition, a kinship that both comforted and unsettled him. And for the first time in 8 years, Preston Xavier found himself looking forward to tomorrow with something other than grim determination. The weeks that followed fell into an unexpected pattern. Every few days, Preston would make the journey to the Lawson homestead, ostensibly to check on Catherine's well-being and help with the heavier tasks of frontier survival, chopping wood, repairing storm damage, hunting to supplement her dwindling supplies. But as winter's grip tightened on the Wyoming Territory, these visits became more than mere obligation. They became moments of respite from the isolation that had defined both their lives. Over mugs of coffee or bowls of stew, they shared stories of their pasts, their hopes, their daily challenges. Katherine spoke of her life in Boston, of a father who had valued her intelligence enough to educate her far beyond what was typical for young women. Preston, more hesitantly, shared fragments of his own history, his childhood on the frontier, his dreams before the raid that had shattered his family, his years of drifting before finding a place at Diamond Creek. With each visit, the walls Preston had built around himself weakened slightly. He found himself noticing things about Katherine that had nothing to do with survival: the way sunlight caught the golden highlights in her hair, the small furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the musical quality of her rare, genuine laugh. These observations troubled him, yet he couldn't seem to stop them. For her part, Katherine was transforming before his eyes. The refined Boston lady was still evident in her speech and manners, but frontier life was reshaping her physically and mentally. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, now showed the calluses and small scars of daily labor. Her movements had become more efficient, more attuned to the rhythms of survival, and there was a quiet confidence in her bearing that hadn't been there when she first stepped off the stagecoach. By mid-January, when the bitter cold kept most frontier dwellers close to their hearths, Preston found himself making excuses to visit the Lawson homestead more frequently than strictly necessary. Emmett noticed, of course, little escaped the old rancher's attention, but he said nothing beyond a knowing look when Preston would hitch up the sleigh. It was during one such visit, as a rare winter sunset broke through the clouds and cast a golden glow across the snow-covered landscape, that something shifted between them. They had spent the afternoon replacing a section of the cabin's chinking that had crumbled in the extreme cold. Working side by side, passing tools and materials in comfortable silence, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt strangely natural. When the job was complete, they stood back to admire their handiwork, shoulders almost touching in the cramped space of the cabin's exterior wall. "We make a good team," Katherine observed, brushing dust from her hands. Preston nodded, acutely aware of her proximity. "You're a quick study. Most city folks take years to adapt to frontier life if they ever do." "Perhaps I was meant for this life all along," she replied, her gaze moving across the snow-covered valley that had become her home. "In Boston, I always felt constrained, as though I was playing a role designed by others." She turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her honey-colored hair. "Here, despite all the hardships, or perhaps because of them, I feel more myself than I ever have." The honesty in her voice, the quiet certainty of her words, stirred something in Preston's chest. Standing there in the fading light, Katherine Lawson seemed to embody the spirit of the frontier itself: resilient, uncompromising, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with drawing-room conventions. "Katherine," he began, uncertain what he intended to say but compelled to speak nonetheless. Before he could continue, a wolf's howl echoed across the valley, close, too close for comfort. Preston's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his back. "Inside," he said, all other thoughts forgotten. "They rarely approach cabins, but this winter's been hard on game." Katherine didn't argue, following him quickly into the cabin and securing the door behind them. The interior felt suddenly smaller, more intimate as darkness gathered outside and the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls. "Do wolves often come this close to homesteads?" she asked, moving to peer through the window. "Not usually," Preston replied, joining her, "but hunger makes predators bold." They stood side by side at the window, watching as two gray wolves emerged from the tree line at the edge of the property. The animals moved with cautious purpose, their lean bodies evidence of the winter's scarcity. "They're magnificent," Katherine whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Preston glanced at her, surprised by the response. Most frontier women would have reacted with fear, not admiration. "They're also dangerous." "As is everything worth knowing on the frontier, it seems," she replied, a hint of a smile curving her lips as she turned to face him. In that moment, with firelight gilding her features and her blue eyes reflecting both wisdom and wonder, Katherine Lawson was simply the most beautiful thing Preston Xavier had ever seen. The realization hit him with physical force, stealing his breath and sending his carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to her cheek, fingers gentle against her skin. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch, her lips parting on a soft inhalation. "I should go," Preston said, his voice rough with emotions he'd denied for too long. "Before the light fades completely." Catherine's hand came up to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "The wolves," she reminded him softly, "and the trail will be dangerous in darkness, perhaps." "Perhaps you should stay." The invitation hung between them, laden with meanings neither was quite ready to articulate. Preston knew he stood at a crossroads, one path leading back to the familiar isolation he'd chosen years ago, the other toward something unknown and terrifying in its potential for both joy and devastation. "If I stay," he said carefully, "things will change between us." Catherine's gaze never wavered. "I believe they already have, Preston." The simple truth of her words broke something loose within him. When Preston Xavier bent to kiss Katherine Lawson in the firelit quiet of her uncle's cabin, with wolves prowling outside and snow beginning to fall once more, it felt less like a beginning and more like a recognition, an acknowledgement of something that had been growing between them since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. Her lips were soft beneath his, tentative at first, then responding with a warmth that threatened to melt the ice he'd built around his heart. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions he'd denied himself for so long. "I've been fighting this," he admitted quietly, "fighting it because caring about someone on the frontier is the surest path to heartbreak." Catherine's hands came up to frame his face, compelling him to look at her. "The frontier takes much from us, Preston, but if we refuse to live, to connect, to care, then it has already won." Her wisdom, so simple and yet so profound, struck Preston with the force of revelation. For 8 years, he had been surviving but not living, existing in a self-imposed isolation that he had mistaken for strength. That night, as the wolves howled in the distance and the winter wind rattled the cabin's windows, Preston stayed. They talked until the fire burned low, sharing hopes and fears that neither had voiced before. Katherine spoke of her determination to make the homestead thrive, to prove to herself and the world that a woman alone could claim her place on the frontier. Preston revealed his dream of someday having his own ranch, of building something that would last beyond his lifetime. When exhaustion finally overtook them, Preston took the chair by the fire, insisting that Katherine take the bed. Despite the discomfort, he slept more peacefully than he had in years, lulled by the soft sound of her breathing across the small cabin. Morning brought clarity along with fresh snow. As they shared a simple breakfast, Preston knew that a decision waited, not just about when to return to Diamond Creek, but about what path his life would take from this moment forward. "I need to speak with Emmett," he said finally, "about us, about what happens next." Katherine nodded, her expression serious but her eyes warm with unspoken understanding. "And what do you think happens next, Preston Xavier?" The question was direct, characteristic of the woman who had faced every frontier challenge with unflinching courage. Preston knew she deserved nothing less than complete honesty in return. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'm tired of fighting what I feel for you. I think that you've shown me that there's more to survival than just staying alive. And I think that if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, with Emmett's blessing and according to frontier custom." The smile that illuminated Catherine's face was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission had cost him. "I would like that very much," she said simply, "though I warn you, I remain as stubborn and independent as ever." Preston laughed, a weight lifting from his chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged until its absence. "I would expect nothing less, Katherine Lawson." When he finally departed for Diamond Creek, the trail seemed less daunting, the winter landscape more beautiful than threatening. Something fundamental had shifted within Preston Xavier, a recognition that the frontier's harshness didn't negate the possibility of joy, that connection wasn't weakness but the very strength needed to endure. Emmett Johnson received Preston's news with less surprise than expected. "About time you figured it out," the old rancher said, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "Been watching you dance around your feelings for that girl all winter." Preston felt heat rise to his face. "I intend to court her properly, with your blessing." Emmett's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "You have it. Katherine Lawson's proven her mettle this winter. Frontier needs more women like her, and more men wise enough to recognize their value." He struck a match, puffing his pipe to life. What's your plan? Can't imagine she'll abandon that homestead she's fought so hard for. The question gave Preston pause. He hadn't thought beyond acknowledging his feelings for Katherine, hadn't considered the practical aspects of a future together. I don't know yet, he admitted, but we'll figure it out together. Spring's arrival transformed the Wyoming Territory with startling swiftness. Snow retreated from the valleys, revealing muddy earth eager for planting. Creeks swelled with meltwater, grass emerged tender and green, and wildlife returned from winter hideaways. The landscape's rebirth mirrored the change in Preston Xavier's life as he officially began courting Katherine Lawson. The courtship followed frontier custom, simpler than Eastern norms but no less meaningful. Preston would ride to the Lawson homestead 3 times a week, helping with spring preparations while learning more about the woman who had captured his heart. They planted Katherine's first garden together, repaired winter damage to the outbuildings, and discussed plans for expanding the small corral to accommodate the mare and colt Preston had gifted her from Diamond Creek stock. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as twilight painted the mountains, sharing dreams and building a vision of a future neither had imagined possible just months before. Katherine spoke of turning the homestead into a viable ranch, using the knowledge gleaned from her uncle's journals and Preston's experience. Preston, in turn, shared his hopes of combining his savings with her land to create something that belonged truly to both of them. Word of their courtship spread quickly through Sweetwater and the surrounding homesteads. The frontier community, initially skeptical of the Boston lady who had arrived so unprepared for Wyoming's challenges, now regarded Katherine with growing respect. She had survived one of the harshest winters in memory, transformed her uncle's abandoned cabin into a proper home, and captured the heart of Preston Xavier, a man many had thought permanently closed to such emotions. As spring blossomed into early summer, their relationship deepened beyond the initial attraction to something more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and genuine understanding. Preston found himself opening up about memories long buried, stories of his parents, the dreams he'd had as a boy, the grief he'd carried for 8 lonely years. Katherine, in turn, revealed more of her life in Boston, the stifling expectations, her father's financial troubles, the desperate choices that had driven her west. One warm June evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Katherine turned to Preston with unusual seriousness. "There's something I need to show you," she said, rising and extending her hand. "Something I should have shared sooner." Curious, Preston followed her into the cabin and watched as she retrieved a small wooden box from beneath her bed. When she opened it, he saw a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These are from my uncle," Katherine explained, carefully untying the bundle. "Not the recent ones that brought me here, but letters he wrote to my father years ago when they were young men." She selected one and handed it to Preston. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting bold and slanting, much like James Lawson himself had been. "Read the marked passage," Katherine urged softly. Preston's eyes found the paragraph she had indicated. "You would not recognize this valley now, Thomas. What was once nothing but sage and dust has become something fine under my hands. The creek runs clear all year, the soil proves richer than any had guessed, and the views of the mountains would humble even your artist's eye. I have claimed this place, brother, not just with legal documents but with sweat and blood. When I am gone, I would have it passed to someone who understands its value beyond mere dollars. Your Katherine, perhaps. The girl has your spirit and mother's backbone. This land could be her freedom, should she ever need it." Preston looked up from the letter to find Katherine watching him intently, her blue eyes luminous in the lamplight. "He knew," she said quietly. "Somehow, years before my father's death, before my situation became desperate, Uncle James knew I might need this place." Her voice caught slightly, not just as property, but as purpose. The revelation struck Preston deeply. James Lawson, a man he had known only as a taciturn neighbor, had shown such foresight, such understanding of a niece he barely knew. And Katherine, driven west by necessity, had found not just refuge but true belonging in this remote valley. "Your uncle was wiser than most gave him credit for," Preston said, carefully refolding the letter, "and he was right about you." Katherine's hand covered his, "Which brings me to what I've been considering these past weeks." She took a deep breath. "I want to build this homestead into something lasting, a proper ranch, with cattle and crops and a legacy worth passing on, but I don't want to do it alone anymore." Preston's heart quickened. "What are you suggesting, exactly?" A partnership, Katherine said firmly, legal and otherwise. A blush colored her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. I'm asking you to marry me, Preston Xavier. Not just because I love you, though I do more than I thought possible, but because together we could build something neither of us could create alone. The directness of her proposal, so characteristic of the woman herself, left Preston momentarily speechless. In Katherine Lawson, he had found not just love but a true partner, someone who understood the frontier's challenges and faced them with unflinching courage. When he finally found his voice, the words came easily. Yes, he said simply, yes to marriage, to partnership, to building a life together. He reached for her hands, holding them between his own. But I insist on doing this properly, with a ring and on one knee, as soon as I can get to Sweetwater for the necessary items. Katherine's laugh, that rare musical sound he had come to treasure, filled the small cabin. Always the traditionalist, she teased, her eyes bright with happiness. Very well, I accept your acceptance of my proposal. 2 weeks later, with a simple gold band purchased from Sweetwater's general store, Preston formally proposed on the porch of the homestead that would soon become their shared home. Katherine, dressed in her finest blue dress with wildflowers in her honey-colored hair, accepted with tears of joy that belied her usual composure. Their wedding took place in late July, with the mountains green and purple in the distance and wildflowers carpeting the valley. The entire community gathered to witness the union. Emmett and his wife, the shopkeepers from Sweetwater, neighboring ranchers and homesteaders who had come to respect both the Boston lady and the once solitary cowboy. The ceremony was simple, frontier practical, but no less meaningful for its lack of Eastern refinements. As Preston Xavier looked into Katherine Lawson's eyes and promised to love and protect her for all his days, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a single year. The walls he had built around his heart had not just crumbled but been rebuilt into something stronger, a foundation for love, family, and purpose. When the vows were spoken and the simple gold band slid onto Katherine's finger, Preston held her close against his heart. In that moment, with the Wyoming sun warm on their shoulders and the future stretching before them like the endless frontier itself, he knew with absolute certainty that she was his heart's desire, not a weakness to be feared, but the very strength he needed to truly live. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Xavier Ranch, as the combined Lawson homestead and Preston's investment came to be known. The harsh Wyoming Territory tested their partnership through droughts and blizzards, through cattle disease and market fluctuations. Yet for every hardship, there were moments of profound contentment, sunsets viewed from their expanded porch, successful cattle drives, the gradual transformation of the small cabin into a proper ranch house. In their 3rd year of marriage, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, after Preston's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, named James in honor of the uncle whose foresight had made their union possible. The children grew strong and spirited, learning the ways of the frontier from parents who valued both education and practical knowledge. On a golden autumn evening 10 years after Katherine had first stepped off the stagecoach in Sweetwater, she and Preston stood on the ridge overlooking their property. Below them sprawled the fruits of their decade together, a thriving ranch with sturdy outbuildings, healthy cattle grazing in fertile pastures, fields recently harvested, and a home filled with books, laughter, and love. "Did you ever imagine this?" Katherine asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder as they watched their children racing each other back toward the house. "When you first found me struggling with that armload of wood?" Preston smiled, his arm tightening around her waist. "Never. I was too busy being terrified by this stubborn Boston lady who refused to acknowledge the frontier's dangers." "And now," she prompted, turning in his embrace to look up at him. "Now," Preston said, meeting her gaze with the openness that had replaced his once guarded expression, "I thank God every day for the blizzard that forced me to stay, for wolves that prowled at twilight, and for a woman brave enough to propose when I was still finding my courage." Katherine Xavier rose on her toes to kiss her husband, her blue eyes as bright and determined as the day they'd met. "The frontier takes much from us," she echoed her own words from years before, "but what it gives in return to those willing to fight for it is beyond price." As they walked hand in hand back toward the home they had built together, literally and figuratively, Preston reflected on how thoroughly his understanding of survival had changed. The frontier hadn't softened over the years, but facing its challenges alongside Katherine had revealed a truth he once thought impossible, that in the harshest of territories, it was connection, not isolation, that truly allowed one to thrive. The lonely cowboy who had once believed the frontier was no place for love had found not just survival, but genuine happiness in the arms of a woman who had refused to accept the limitations others placed upon her. Together they had transformed a forgotten homestead into a legacy for their children, and in doing so had proven that even in the untamed Wyoming Territory, love could not just survive but flourish. When Preston Xavier held Katherine close under the vast Wyoming sky, he knew with absolute certainty that she was, and always would be, his heart's desire.